If it wasn't clear from Jim, we are completely intolerant of any act or any kind of policy or movement such as for nationalism or whatever cause people would want to take up, which will result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people just because they were of a different nationality than the people rising up, just because they were of a different religion. We think for these acts to never be eulogized and for these acts to never be thought of as legitimate responses to state oppressions, we have to be able to tell people that the objective act of rising up against other people and destroying them by the hundreds and raping by the hundreds is something we can never tolerate. What are the two things coming from me? Firstly, I'm going to talk about how you prevent people from being able to eulogize and raise this person's status up after their death. Because we want to make absolutely sure that no one can take up his cause afterwards without feeling that they are going to be destroyed. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how you're going to further draw out the hardline stance of states and society in general against people who dare commit such crimes. No thank you. But let's deal with a little response coming from previous speaker. She tries to have this little straw man on this, especially on this idea of premeditated crimes, saying that, well, anyone who has tried to murder or rape or steal probably had a degree of premeditation. So we don't see why there should be some specific, nuance towards perpetrators of crimes of people against crimes against humanity. Clearly, she wasn't listening to the speech coming from Jim, right? Because we are not just dealing with people who premeditated to be able to rob a bank or to rob a house. No, thank you. The people who commit crimes against humanity were probably government officials who took years to be able to gain the trust and power and resources of hundreds of thousands of people and got them to trust their very lives in him, and then suddenly betrayed all those hundreds of thousands of people to create a civil war against Serbs or Croatians or Muslims and Christians. This is the kind of premeditation that Jim was talking about. This is the nuance of the debate. You are not responding to the kinds of monsters we're dealing with. No, thank you. Secondly, this is her argument, right, on this idea of security. Poor response to that. No, thank you. This idea that there will always be people who will try to fight, for nationalism or against the West will always exist, so long as the West exists, so long as differing ideologies exist. So there is no clear nuance from her on why either side is going to get either better or worse security, given that the fight is always going to go on. No, thank you. Secondly, if it's about being able to spawn more enemies and more supporters, that is going to be worse on your side if you allow people to be able to view his burial with respect and dignity as a human being. That's why people had to dump Osama bin Laden's body into the ocean rather than being able to try to give him a burial. That's why the United States decided to bury Che Guevara without burial rites. They did not want any supporters and anyone who felt that their lives were touched by him to continue his cause. No, thank you. Thirdly, on this idea that people are still going to continue fighting against the West with renewed fight, we think, really, how many other people are going to be continued to incentivize fighting against the West or fighting other states, just to be able to oppress other minorities, if they already see a state that is going to be intolerant of them and going to wipe them out of history if they dare try to violate any other of their citizens to the causes of nationalism or things like that. Lastly, we think there was no response to the first argument on Jim, on her analysis on when we can or when we can't respect rights. Jim clearly already gave you the framework we are working in with this debate when we are dealing with people who committed crimes against humanity. The standard was simple. We can only give you rights if you are willing to respect other people's rights and make your actions specifically for that, and these people don't. But fine.
If you look at it, these kinds of terrorist movements, for example, don't end just the moment their leaders die. They can continue to propagate as long as that message continues. What are you doing to address that?
I'm going to get to that argument later, right? But lastly, on this idea of double failure, because the state will be seen as unmerciful. We think that kind of unmercifulness will always exist as long as the United States always looks like an enemy, right? But the kind of mercy you're trying to forward is what exactly allows politicians or governments in extremely, unstable states to use that mercy and try to rally people to their cause to start committing genocide and mass rape. That's extremely problematic. Let's go to the case to deal with that. The first argument is how now you prevent people from being able to raise up the status of person after death. This is the premise. We think the treatment and attention of bodies given after death can easily become a rallying point for the discourses and beliefs that people have surrounding that person's corpse, which is the kind of analysis Jim was talking about when we're able to gain respect for a person after death and in his burial rites because we think that we're trying to eulogize this person as someone trying to make it in life. No, thank you. We think burials then are extremely personal affairs because hundreds of thousands of people, such as their relatives and supporters, turn out to give their personal efforts and their personal affairs and personal last respect. No, thank you. Things like reflections. No, thank you. Such as being able to maintain vigils and processions. Because at the end of the day, burial rites highlight the most basic human being you were able to interact with and the person whose life you were touched by. No, thank you. That is extremely harmful if you want the most objective and powerful condemnation of people such as mass murderers and mass rapists. Because these burial rites forward the idea that ultimately whatever mistakes or atrocities this person committed in life were for other human beings. Because these people didn't just commit crimes against humanity because he wanted to murder 100,000 people. He rallied hundreds of thousands of followers under ideas of nationalism identity and convinced them using all of these resources that the murder and rape of 100,000 other Jews or whatever was completely fine as long as it was for nationalism. We think, no thank you, allowing people to eulogize that thing lets in subjectivity and continue to for support for anyone who is willing to continue his cause through the objectively harmful acts of mass murder, war, and rape. No one under any circumstances can ever be allowed to forward causes to try to combat any oppression put on them by equally or greater acts of oppression. How does our proposition solve that? Firstly, understanding that having no burial rites means that there is no way for you to personalize that person's death and burial, and no way for you to be able to try to raise him up in your status because there is no body for you to be able to rally around supporters and give your last respects. What you're essentially treating him as much, not just for someone we're trying to get closure as, but as much on history we would rather forget and rather get on our lives afterwards. Secondly, we think we draw the line further on how tolerant or intolerant we can be against mass murderers. We think the final straw we were going to have was going to have courts to be able to try him. But even then, we're only trying him as a thing that committed mass murder and mass rape and objective crimes against humanity. We think after that, we have every right to dispose of him as a kind of disease or as a kind of harm against human beings. What did opening government bring to you today? Firstly, we gave you the extremely essential framework necessary to analyze how we mistreat the most vicious and cruel human beings, or human things to have ever walked this planet. And secondly, we've talked about on how we can get rid of these people in history and allow people to move on. We're very proud to propose.